Devil on the Dance Floor by P.J. Thorndike. Copyright 2023 by P.J. Thorndike. New York City, 1976. The Pandora Club was a hot, sweaty joint in Bayside, Queens. The dance floor throbbed to the DJ as loafers tapped out the rhythm of the dance. Floral polyester shirts were thrown off hue by the spinning lights which glinted off the disco ball and caused gold pendants to wink from their nests in chest hair and bracelets to twinkle on slim, tanned wrists. Brute and Charlie Blue scented the fetid air, doing their best to mask the unpleasant smell of body odour. Laura was aware of the boy watching her from the bar, his eyes staring across the crowded dance floor while the fluctuating lights cast his handsome face in alternating primary colours. She pretended not to notice him, took a sip of her Bacardi and Coke, and with a toss of her curls, attempted to reintegrate herself into the conversation. They were sitting in one of the booths, about 5 of them, all girls. A few guys loitered to the side, denied seats, but waiting for one of them to get up and make a move towards the dance floor so that they could make their move. Until then, they had to stand on occasion. Cleo was telling the girls all about some guy at her modelling agency who was into her and how she had kept rebuffing him. "He doesn't even have a car," she yelled over the pulse of the music. "I know he lives in Manhattan, but geez." Cleo was everything a girl in the place like the Pandora could dream to be. Beautiful, fashionable and confident, a genuine face. Guys flocked to her, and she dealt with them with a cool detachment, taking her pick of the crop but never keeping any of them around for more than one night. Her real name was Anna, but she had insisted on being called Cleo ever since she saw Liz Taylor in Cleopatra in the 5th grade. She had worn Egyptian-style eyeliner for months. But that was Cleo through and through, never lacking the confidence to reinvent herself, to demand more from the world than it had given a girl from a poor Brooklyn family. Cleo's most recent squeeze emerged from the bathroom, his eyes buzzing with cocaine and a faint trace of powder still visible on his top lip. Cleo made room for him, and he pushed his way into the booth to sit beside her, earning some envious glances from the boys who crowded around the booth, wondering what he had that they didn't. "Tony, you're sitting on my Gucci purse," Cleo complained. "My name is Danny," the guy complained. "Like it matters," Cleo said to her friends with a roll of her eyes. They all giggled except Laura. Daniel's face coloured and he tried to ignore the insult. He had to if he wanted any action from Cleo that night. Once upon a time, Laura and Cleo had been best friends. They had practically grown up together, their families living on the same street, and both girls attending the same schools. But adulthood had a way of driving a wedge between childhood friends, and Laura suspected it was mostly her fault. She had been the first to leave, getting a good job in an advertising agency, moving out and renting an apartment in Crown Heights. Cleo had hung around for a while after that, desperately trying to get her modelling career off the ground. There would be no boring, sensible jobs for her. A model was all she had ever wanted to be, and it hadn't been until last year that it had suddenly taken off in a way that could only be described as meteoric. She had scored a contract with a big agency in Manhattan, which had put her on the cover of Vogue, and Cleo had already earned enough money to buy her family a beach house in the Hamptons. Laura knew that Cleo's time in dives like the Pandora would soon be over. Before long, the disco and its bridge and tunnel crowd would be beneath her. In fact, Laura was surprised that Cleo was still slumming it on a Saturday night, when she surely had more glamorous friends and trendy haunts on the island. "Looks like you've got some action," Cleo said to Laura, flitting her beautiful lashes in the direction of the boy at the bar. The comment was so sudden and jarring that at first Laura wasn't sure that Cleo was talking to her. It was like her friend had momentarily forgotten all the other girls and remembered the old days when they had been inseparable. "Oh," said Laura, "him. Yeah, he's been watching me for the past half hour. He's cute, I guess. But not as cute as those guys you've been dating from your advertising job, am I right?" Cleo giggled, and Laura knew that she was teasing. There were no cute guys at her work. In fact, all the men she worked with were dull and old. That's why she spent her Saturday nights at the Pandora. It kept her feeling young. Christ, she would be 30 soon. She might have the money now, but her new life lacked the youthful, vibrant energy she still craved. "Go work your magic, honey," Cleo urged. Laura considered it. He was cute. Tall, with an obvious athletic physique by the way he filled out his satin shirt. He had dark brown David Cassidy hair and a chiselled face that the disco lights accentuated. He was still looking at her, obvious. Intentionally obvious. "You know," she said, "I think I might." "Atta girl," said Cleo with a wide grin, reeling back into the arm of her date, the straw of her drink struggling to find her mouth. Laura got up and wove her way around the edge of the dance floor. She slid up onto a free bar stool and plucked a cigarette and lighter from her purse and lit it. "Buy you a drink?" the boy said, appearing as she had known he would, at her side like magic. "Sure," she said. "Rum and coke." "You got it. Name's Grady. Laura. Pleased to meet you." Her drink arrived and they talked some more, struggling to hear each other over the music. He sipped a vodka on the rocks while she found herself babbling, telling him too much. Slow down, girl. Geez, she was out of practice. "You want to dance?" he asked her. Sure. She thought he'd never ask, and was glad of the opportunity to shut her mouth. He led her out onto the dance floor, where it was hot and crowded. The press of bodies was intense, and they barely had room to move their feet. Grady impressed her with a few moves, and people magically started to give them some room. Then he took her hand and led her into a very smooth dance, in which she struggled to keep up. Boy, he really knew his stuff. They danced, and Laura felt herself caught up in the thrill of being with somebody new and exciting, somebody who gave all his attention to her like she was the most important person in the world. Everybody else on the dance floor took note of Grady's skill. He was top dog, and eyes were on the pair of them as he twirled her around, catching her as she felt control slipping from her grasp. The dance floor formed the hustle, everybody stepping and turning in synchronism, and it was a primal, sweaty confusion of bare skin and wild hair, dizzying motion and kaleidoscopic colour. They were as one sexual animal, all bulges and smooth curves in sausage-skin pants, open shirts and sweaty limbs. This was their ritual, their tribal dance, a primal scream from the gutters of New York City, and it was utterly intoxicating. They took a cab back to Grady's place in Brooklyn Heights, a classy brownstone with ivy clinging to one side of its hexagonal corner tower. Grady either owned or rented the penthouse suite, which was luxurious with thick shag carpets and framed movie posters on the wall. There was an immaculate hi-fi system and a whole library of records. Bay windows looked out over the harbour and the skyline of the lower part of Manhattan. Man, this guy has to be loaded, Laura thought. "So, what is it you do?" she asked him while he fixed them a pair of screwdrivers at the bar. Grady smiled. "Photographer," he said. "Yeah? What kind?" "Architecture, mostly." "Ever shoot models, fashion mags?" "Not really. Not for magazines, at least. Only private commissions. I prefer buildings anyway. Bridges, that kind of thing. There's something more honest about them." "My friend Chloe is a model. She was with me tonight. Tall girl with a black bob. Did you see her?" "Yeah, I might have done," he replied as he stirred their drinks. "She's under contract with the Ford agency. They put her on the cover of Vogue. I can't remember which issue." She was rambling again, and Grady didn't seem that interested, so she shut up and tried to play it cool. She was drunk, and she wanted him to fuck her. They drank their screwdrivers and then did a line of coke each off the marble bar top. Then he took her to the bedroom, which was nearly filled by a large circular bed. Framed photographs dotted the bedroom walls. Black and white studies of buildings, graffiti street subway cars, burned tenements and kids playing on piles of rubble. Street scenes of New York's urban blight. "Some of your work?" she asked him as he unbuttoned her blouse and nuzzled her neck. "Yeah." His kisses aroused her to greater heights, and there was no more time for conversation. He pulled her down on top of him, and they rolled over, squirming out of their clothes. Laura felt titillatingly exposed in that bay window with the entire city beyond it, like she was an exhibit in a museum, or one of those girls in Amsterdam. Maybe it was the booze, maybe it was the coke, or maybe it was him. But she found the experience thrilling rather than uncomfortable. And as for Grady, he sure knew what buttons to push. He did everything right, like a concert pianist reeling off a complex concerto, hitting every note with perfection. She ran her hands over his hard, muscular body as he worked her towards her climax. She orgasmed, and then so did he, and then they lay side by side, sticky with sweat in the moonlight, the smoke from their cigarettes forming patterns in the air above them. They saw a lot of each other after that. They met for coffee and discussed their relationship. He seemed keen to see more of her, and that pleased her immensely. They went to the movies and saw Taxi Driver. Then Grady took her to a disco in Bay Ridge where he really strutted his stuff and drew a big crowd. Laura loved being with him. She loved being seen with him. Sometimes he took her on tours to the deep, dark corners of the city where he would seek out subjects for his photographs. He took her to the South Bronx, East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Untermeyer Park up in Yonkers. He drove a wood-panelled station wagon, which nearly made her laugh out loud the first time she saw it. She thought a rich photographer would drive something a bit smarter than a shitty family car. "All right, I know the car isn't exactly much to shout about," he said, detecting her mirth, "but it's great for carting all my equipment around." She would watch as he took hundreds of pictures of abandoned buildings, sidewalks under bridges that stank of piss, graffiti, homeless people, and burnt-out cars. He seemed fascinated by the ugly side of life, of decay, desolation, and things that most people would cross the street to avoid. At first she didn't get it, but when he developed the shots back in his dark room in his apartment, she understood. He was somehow able to draw beauty out of ruin and cast the filthy, grimy side of New York City in tasteful black and white. When they were having coffee in their favourite haunt one afternoon after she had finished work, he invited her to a party with some of his friends. "They're a pretty wild crowd," he said. "Eccentric, artsy types. Think you can stomach it?" "Sure," she replied. It was the first time Grady had mentioned any friends, and she had begun to suspect that he was a loner with no family or other relationships in the city. She couldn't wait to meet the kind of people who moved in his circle. The party was at a large house in Yonkers. The dark furniture was antique, and the walls were decorated with paintings and lined with bookshelves that didn't hold a single paperback. No framed movie posters or photographs of urban blight here, thought Laura. This is an old person's house. It didn't seem like Grady's type of haunt at all, and as she was introduced to everybody, the mystery only deepened. There were about a dozen in total, a real mix of young and old. A trio of 20-somethings lounged on the sofa doing lines of coke as they passed a mirror around. 5 or 6 others danced on the oak floor to the sounds of ELO from the record player. An elderly man mixed cocktails behind the bar, and 2 middle-aged women who were overdressed in evening gowns and opera gloves sat at the bar, black cigarette holders in their hands. Laura had never had a head for names, and they all whirled past her like a head rush. Grady seemed to pick up on it, and he squeezed her arm gently, whispering into her ear, "Names aren't important. Just get into the groove." The groove accommodated her easily, as a drink was pushed into her hand and she was ushered to a seat on the sofa next to the coke snorters. She declined the mirror that was being passed around and sipped her cocktail. It was strong, and she couldn't quite identify the spirits used. She found it funny that the name of the drink, like the name of everybody here except Grady, had completely escaped her. It was a loud party, and everybody seemed to be on cloud 9. Laura did her best not to be in a shrinking violet, but she found the conversational topics so obscure there was rarely an opportunity for her to offer a comment. They rapped on academic subjects like European esoteric circles, Eliphas Levi, and witchcraft, Grady proving that he was widely versed in all 3 subjects, which surprised Laura. He had never mentioned any interest in the occult to her, but then why would he, as all of this went above her head anyway? The only other person who looked out of place was a blonde girl, a couple of years younger than Laura, who sat opposite her. She wore a white halter dress with rhinestones and nursed her cocktail, smiling at jokes and generally trying to look like she was joining in. Laura wondered who had brought her, but nobody seemed to have her under their wing. Instead, everybody seemed keen to be her host, always topping up her glass, offering her cigarettes, and occasionally throwing her the charitable conversational bone. As the evening went on, Laura's head began to feel very heavy. Everything in the room didn't seem quite real. Not like a dream exactly, just stripped of all meaning, irrelevant. The party got more raucous, with people horsing around and dancing like mad things. Had somebody turned up the music? Soon people were jumping on top of each other, making out. Men and women, men and men, women and women. It was a free-for-all. God, they're swingers, Laura thought, nearly giggling out loud. Is this the kind of scene Grady is into? Where have you brought me? She said into his ear, meaning it to be a whisper, but seeing him wince a little at how loud she was. Boy, am I loaded. Don't worry, he told her. They're a good crowd, just a little wild. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. He was being kind, but in truth, Laura felt intrigued by the whole thing. She had never even had a threesome before, and this was simply wild. Let's take this party next door, somebody said, and then the whole room seemed to spin in a kaleidoscope of colours as everybody got up. Laura felt herself being hauled to her feet and carried along in the cheerful tide to a bedroom decorated in the weirdest style. A large stained-glass window occupied the far wall. She couldn't make out what it depicted, but it was some sort of biblical monster surrounded by angels, or were they demons? The light from it painted the room in a psychedelic glow. There was an altar of some sort, and a lectern upon which lay a large black book. Then she saw the cameras and the lights. Studio equipment had been set up around the altar, which she suddenly realized was a set. Even the stained-glass window was a phony, lit from behind by a lamp. The blonde girl was led over to the altar and undressed by 2 members of the party. She didn't seem to mind or care. How stoned is she? Laura wondered. Does she even know what's happening to her? Completely naked, the girl was laid down on the altar and her limbs spread out so that she resembled a starfish. Black candles were lit and placed next to each hand. The ones who had undressed her slipped out of their own clothes and squatted on either side, caressing her hands and licking the palms. Awed by the kinky scene being acted out before her, Laura realized that the old man had started rolling the camera. He was filming the entire thing, probably for his own or somebody else's erotic consumption. Others began to disrobe, including Grady. He looked at her, bare-chested, his pants unbuckled and sagging around his hips. "Come on," he said. "Join in the fun." "Oh, I don't know," Laura said, her aroused curiosity at being a spectator suddenly giving way to uncertainty by the prospect of being a participant. "It's just fun and games," Grady said. "Nothing heavy, no strings." She should have said no. She should have remembered the camera, that this was all being filmed, preserved, to be shown to God knew who. But the whole evening was like some wild trip, none of it real, none of it important. Almost without realizing it, she had begun to take her dress off, and then her underwear, until she was as naked as the rest of them. The rest of it seemed like a blur when she later tried to recall the series of events and put the confusing scatter of scenes into some sort of order. She remembered Grady leading her over to the altar. Everybody was joining in now, and she remembered the sight of a dozen or so pairs of hands feeling their way all over the pale, quivering flesh of the blonde girl on the altar. Then she remembered those hands running all over her, and her own hands getting into the mix, caressing penises, breasts, buttocks, not knowing who they belonged to. They were on top of the altar, on top of the girl, in one primal, sweaty confusion of limbs, hair, and sexual organs. Somebody ejaculated on her right thigh, and she felt the warm, sticky mess get smeared away by somebody else and mixed in with all the sweat and other bodily fluids. It was so hot, and her body felt beyond her control. This was all so far beyond anything she had ever experienced that she honestly didn't know who she was anymore. And then the knife appeared, cold and hard amid a world of soft, warm flesh. It felt alien, and even in her fevered state, Laura knew that it did not belong, that it meant danger. She tried to edge away from it, not wanting to feel its coldness or the sting of its sharpness. Others also seemed to slither out of its path, and they sank down onto the floor on either side of the altar. The girl's limbs were still held down, and the hand that held the knife, whoever it was raised high above her chest. The others began to chant, some churchy Latin stuff. The knife quivered in the air, expectant, pregnant with anticipation. This seemed to be the climax to the whole thing, and Laura expected the old man to shout "Cut!" at any moment. But instead the chanting suddenly stopped, and the knife jerked down, its tip sinking into the girl's belly. "It's a trick," Laura thought. "A trick knife. One of those ones from a joke shop where the blade goes into the handle, that's all." But the blood seemed real. It oozed from the wound and around the blade of the knife to run down on either side of the girl's body. She writhed and gasped for air, not really seeming to be in any pain, but her body clearly registering that something was wrong. "She's been drugged. She's been drugged this whole time. She's been prepared for this." The blade was wrenched free, and then Laura knew that it was no trick. Blood spurted from the hole in the girl's belly, and the chanting began again, increasing in tempo. The girl writhed against her captors, and her eyes rolled about frantically in their sockets, her mouth an O of horror. Somebody was standing over her, looking into her eyes, the bloody knife dropping little spots of red onto her breasts. Laura felt sick. She wanted to be gone, away from all of this. She could run. She should run. But even if she weren't so terrified of one of the group catching her and doing the same thing to her that had been done to the girl on the altar, she knew that her body would not follow her commands. "I'm drugged too," she thought. "I've been sucked into something, and I don't know how to get out of it." The knife blade was placed against the girl's throat, and she made eye contact with her murderer. There almost seemed to be a pleading look in those beautiful blue eyes, as if she was begging her executioner to end all this now, to put her out of her misery. They complied, and the blade was drawn slowly across the pale, slender neck, its sharpness severing jugular and even tendons which snapped with sickening jerks. Blood sheeted the girl's breasts and ran down the sides of the altar. The hellish congregation reached out with groping hands to scoop up the blood, and they began to daub themselves with it, still chanting their incomprehensible mantra. Laura wanted to scream as she felt the blood, hot and coppery, smeared over her face and breasts. Hands slippery with gore rubbed her thighs and genitals, baptizing her in death. She was too frozen with terror, her limbs too paralyzed with whatever she had been drugged with, to fight back. She lay there in the pit of hell itself until there wasn't an inch of her pale flesh that was not coated with the blood of the slain girl. It was around that point that her memories of that night ceased, and she knew only dark oblivion. She woke up naked in her bed, in her apartment in Crown Heights, although how she got there was a mystery. At first she thought Grady had taken her home, but then she remembered that he had never been to her apartment, nor had she ever given him her address. Another thing struck her. She had been showered. The blood that had coated her had been rinsed off. She was tempted to entertain the idea that it had all been some hideous nightmare, but upon closer inspection in the bathroom mirror, she noticed some dried brown residue on her scalp, and she flung herself at the toilet and threw up. She sat for a while on the cold tiles, shivering with revulsion. It was all so impossible, too nightmarish to be real. That girl was dead, and they had all bathed in her blood. She slowly got up and showered until her skin turned pink with hot water and scrubbing. She washed her hair 3 times with 3 different shampoos, and then stood for a while, letting the water rinse her off, the drain slurping down the remnants of the night before. But her head would never be empty of what had happened, her soul never clean. She could hear a distant ringing, and for a moment she thought it was in her head, but then she realized it was the telephone. She quickly dried off, wrapped a towel around her, and went into the kitchen to answer it. "You okay?" said Grady's voice. "Okay," she said. "How could I possibly be okay after last night? It's a shock, I know, but it gets better. You learn to live with it." "Live with it?" she almost screamed. "I don't want to live with it. Jesus Christ, you've done it before, haven't you? You and that crazy group. How many girls have you killed?" "Take it easy," he said, his voice barely showing any emotion. "It's best if you just shut your mind off from it, and for God's sake don't tell anybody." "Don't tell anybody? Boy, mister, I've got news for you. I'm going to the cops, and I'm going to see every last one of you locked up for what you did to that girl." "What we did," he said coldly. "You're on that film too, remember?" Jesus, the film. "If the police ever see that film, then there'll be no way you can tell them that you were an innocent bystander." "Is that why that old bastard filmed the whole thing? To hold it over people as blackmail?" "Only partly." "Who's going to watch that film?" "Prints will be made and sold to private collectors." Laura felt like she was going to throw up again. "You're going to distribute it," she managed. "There's a market for snuff movies. Big money." "Snuff movies?" "Movies where somebody gets killed, for real. Look, all of this is out of our hands, so why worry about it? My point is that I was told to call you this morning, early, before you had a chance to go to the cops." "Told by who?" "Others in the group. They can help you, Laura. They helped me. But you have to keep your mouth shut about what went on. I'm serious. It's not just the evidence they have on you. They're powerful. You have no idea what they're capable of." "I got a fair idea last night." "Then we're on the same page." "I get it. You've been told to put the frighteners on me." "Well, yeah, kind of. But look, I really do dig you, Laura, and I don't want you to think that what happened between us was all a lie, because it wasn't. This guy had to be kidding. A girl was dead, and he had all but threatened her life, and now he wanted to pick up where they left off. Can I see you again?" "Get bent!" she yelled into the receiver. "Fine, fine, you're still sore. But in a few days you'll feel a lot better. I'll be in touch, and remember, not a word to anybody." He hung up. Laura slammed the phone down and collapsed on the sofa, her body racked by desperate sobs. The week passed at a snail's pace for Laura. She went to work, came home, ate, showered and slept, all the while expecting something awful to happen, for the police to come knocking, or somebody worse. But nothing happened. It was Thursday evening that Grady called her. "You're invited to a special meeting, Saturday night," he told her. "Well, I'm not interested." "It's not voluntary." "Or what? If I don't go, then they'll show the film to the police? Incriminate everybody just to spite me? I think it's bullshit." "You still don't get it, do you?" He sounded angry now. "These people are not to be fucked with. They won't go to the police, but you do have to do what they say, or they'll do something terrible to you." "You're terrified of them, aren't you?" He was silent. "How did they get you into this? What have they got on you?" "Nothing. I joined them voluntarily." Bullshit. Nobody says, you know what, I feel like sacrificing some virgins today. I wonder if there are any groups in my area. Don't be flippant. Of course, I didn't know what it was all about until it was too late. I just wanted help with my career. I met a guy who said he could help me. It was all simple stuff in the beginning. Orgies, prayers to Satan, occult stuff, you know? Then it moved on to heavier stuff, sacrificing animals, and then... murder, she finished for him. After that, my career just kind of took off. Strings were pulled. That's how high up this group goes. It was a real deal with the devil, but I had to pledge myself to Satan. We all did. Jesus, are you telling me that these loons are serious about the whole Satan angle? That it wasn't just set dressing for their sick movies? They are deadly serious, Laura. They worship Satan with all the conviction in their hearts. It's not just fun and games. You wish you'd never got involved with them, don't you? He grew very quiet. I guess I do, he said at last. Then get away from them. Quit. I can't, he snapped. It's too late for me. Well, what about me? He was silent. They already know where I live, don't they? Yes. But if I moved, suddenly left without telling anybody, dropped off the map? I don't know. Could they find me then? I honestly don't know. You're being watched. Are they watching me now? She moved over to the window and lifted the side of one of the curtains to peek out. The street was deserted. Cars sat in pools of light thrown down by the street lamps. It had been raining and everything was slick and greasy. One person is assigned to keep you under surveillance, kind of like a guardian. Who? Me. If you left Brooklyn, hell, New York even, and didn't tell me, then you might have a chance. Jesus, I don't know. They're so fucking insidious, Laura. You have no idea. If I left and you said nothing to them, she began, it might buy you some time. Enough time to really disappear. But you'd have to be careful, Laura. Tell nobody. Trust no one. How can I trust you? Why would you help me like this? Because I like you, and I'm sorry for dragging you into this. She said nothing. She had been lied to so much in the past couple of weeks that she didn't know who to believe anymore. But maybe it was like he said. Not everything had been a lie. Just run, Laura, he said. Run and don't look back. He hung up. The next day, Laura began looking for another apartment. She knew she had very little time to get out, as she was expected at this special meeting on Saturday night. Her failure to attend would surely galvanize the group into action. They would be out looking for her, and she needed to be long gone by then. She found a place in Queens. Okay, Queens wasn't exactly the ends of the earth, but it would buy her some time until she figured out a more permanent solution. It occurred to her that she was going to have to change her name, get a new job, do the whole witness protection bit, but off her own bat with no involvement from the police. And she had no idea where to start. The most important thing was to get out of Crown Heights before this cult, or whatever it was onto her. She visited the apartment on Friday afternoon after work, and as she was driving back along the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, a yellow VW Bug crept up behind her and started to tailgate her. She moved over into the next lane, and the Bug slid alongside her passenger door. She turned her head, but the glare of the sinking sun meant that she was unable to get a look at the driver. Suddenly the Bug veered towards her, its wing mirror clipping hers. Laura moved over as far as she could, nearly scraping her paintwork on the barrier. The back of her car began to fishtail, and she gripped the wheel, desperately trying to maintain control. The yellow Bug pressed in, forcing her closer and closer to the barrier. She braked, and a taxicab behind her leapt forward in her rear-view mirror, blasting its horn at her. Can't he see what's happening? Can't he see this maniac in the other lane is at fault? Other cars were honking, clearly outraged at the antics of the driver of the yellow Bug. Panic gripped Laura as she realized that she was being singled out. The driver of the Bug wanted her. The exit for the Williamsburg Bridge approached. The Bug veered away, and for a moment Laura thought it was all over. Just a silly prank. She moved over to the right to follow the expressway down into Williamsburg, and noticed that the Bug was following her, its engine roaring as it forced its way in front of the car in the far right lane. Then it swooped in again, slamming into the side of Laura's car. Laura screamed as her tyres squealed and slid on the asphalt. The wedge-shaped divider between the ramp and the bridge to the expressway was coming up fast, and she was headed right for it. Jesus Christ, he's going to make me crash right into it! A glance in her rear-view mirror told her that no one was behind her. She slammed on her brakes, and the Bug slid across her front fender, swerving and skidding, momentarily out of control. Laura wrenched the wheel to the right, narrowly missing the point of the divider. She crossed 2 lanes of the expressway to the angry blare of horns and left the Bug in the traffic behind her. She could see that it had regained control and was trying to fight its way towards her. She drove as fast as she dared, her heart hammering in her chest. She wove from lane to lane, overtaking as many vehicles as she could, ignoring their angry protests. She was driving like a real hog, but she had to get away from the yellow bug and the maniac behind its wheel. She missed her exit and continued on through South Williamsburg and on into downtown Brooklyn. She wasn't going to lead the bastard to her front door. She had to shake him, even if it meant driving all night. How had they known? It was only Friday, for God's sake. Had they found out that she was planning to move? That meant that there was more than one person watching her, and it also meant that they knew Grady had tried to help her. Had they tapped his phone? She had to warn him. He might have sucked her into this, but he had tried to help her, and now the cult might try and kill him too. She owed him that much. She tried to calm herself as she turned off into Brooklyn Heights. There was no sign of the yellow bug in her rearview mirror. She had given them a slip, for now. As she turned onto Remsen Street, she saw a police car and an ambulance below Grady's brownstone, their silently rotating lights painting the surrounding buildings with flashes of red and blue. Yellow tape was stretched across a portion of the sidewalk, and through the press of spectators she could see a white cloth draped over something on the iron rails of the fence that surrounded the brownstone. Beneath it, a pool of blood was steadily spreading across the sidewalk. She parked and got out, her legs unsteady and her stomach churning. She knew it was Grady, that something terrible had happened. She fought her way through the press of people and was able to see the sheeted object in more detail. It was clearly a body, draped across the spiked railing, the sharp points of the iron bars poking up beneath the sheet, red patches soaking the cloth. She looked up and saw Grady's penthouse window directly above. It was open, the curtain billowing in the breeze. "A jumper, you figure?" one member of the crowd said. "What jumper would throw himself onto a fence like that?" said another. "Maybe he missed." Feeling sick, Laura edged her way out of the crowd and back to her car, not wanting to be noticed, not wanting to be seen by anybody. Whoever had done this might still be lurking about, watching, waiting for her. That Grady had been silenced, punished for betraying the cult, was clear. It was also clear that the cult was watching every one of its members. They would be watching her too, she was sure of it, and she knew that she had to disappear as soon as she possibly could. She fought back the tears all the way to her apartment. This was all so crazy it didn't seem real. But it was real, and if she didn't want to end up like Grady, then she had better get used to the fact, damn it. She would go home, pack her things, and be gone first thing in the morning. She parked outside her tenement and headed for the door. Glancing down the street, her heart froze as she spotted a yellow VW Bug parked a little further along. It had a loose fender. Was it the same one that had tried to run her off the road earlier that day? There were lots of yellow bugs in New York City. Was she just being paranoid? Squinting, she could make out the dark figure of somebody sitting behind the wheel. Was he watching her? Her heart in her mouth, she headed indoors and made her way up the stairwell. She stopped to look out of one of the windows and saw the door of the VW swing open and its driver step out. She hurried on, turning a bend in the stairwell and taking another look down at the street. The man was making his way towards her tenement. Shit! There was no denying it now. He was here and he was after her. She heard the heavy door slam several floors below her and the echoing footsteps of somebody climbing the stairs. She looked down and saw a hand gripping the banister as he climbed. Now what? She couldn't go to her apartment. She was trapped. Then she remembered old Mrs. Rispoli, who lived in 5E just a few doors along. She often brought up her mail as the 79-year-old had started to struggle with the stairs. Couldn't she just pop over to borrow something? A cup of sugar, perhaps? She didn't want to drag the nice Mrs. Rispoli into all of this, but she just needed an excuse to not be home until this bastard, whoever he was, went away. She reached the top floor and tried to control her breathing, grateful for the first time that her tenement didn't have an elevator. The man was nearly halfway up the stairwell now, and Laura could hear him wheezing, out of breath. Good, she thought. I hope you have a fucking heart attack, you son of a bitch. She hurried along the door to the apartment of 5E and rang the doorbell. It seemed to take an age for Mrs. Rispoli to answer, and Laura could hear the heavy footsteps of the man in the stairwell climbing the last set of stairs. "Hello, Mrs. Rispoli," she said as soon as the wizened old face appeared in the gap of the slightly open doorway. "Laura," said the old woman, "what can I do for you?" "May I use your phone?" said Laura. She quickly amended her plan to borrow a cup of sugar, as she realized it would mean waiting on Mrs. Rispoli's doorstep while the old lady fetched it for her, and it was an old cliché anyway. "I'm moving, you see, and they've disconnected mine already." "You're moving?" Laura cursed herself. That had been the wrong thing to say. "Oh, honey, I thought you might be when I saw you bringing all those cardboard boxes in yesterday. Where are you going?" Queens. Your phone, Mrs. Rispoli? It's kind of an emergency. Of course, dear. Come on in. Laura nearly bowled the old woman over as she squeezed into the apartment. As she shut the door behind her, she saw the shadow of the man fall upon the landing as he emerged from the stairwell. "What on earth is taking you to Queens?" Mrs. Rispoli said, as she shuffled through her living room towards the avocado-coloured phone hanging from the wall. "Aren't you happy in Brooklyn? Did something happen to your job?" Laura loitered by the window, not sure what she should do now. She wanted to call the police, but knew that she couldn't. She picked up the receiver and pretended to dial, as Mrs. Rispoli started clattering about in the kitchen, fixing them some tea. The tenement building was an H shape, and through the kitchen window of 5E, Laura could see into her own apartment. She could see the front door was open. He must have broken in. Jimmied the lock or something. Then she saw the man in her living room. She gripped the receiver impotently as she watched this stranger move through her apartment, looking for her. He was a stocky type, with an olive-drab army jacket and curly black hair. He went from the living room to the kitchen and then vanished into the bedroom. Laura felt sick as she stood there, watching this man from a distance, knowing that if she had not spotted the yellow bug on the street below, she would not have been alerted to the danger, and would be in that apartment with him right now. He emerged from the bedroom and appeared to be more frantic in his movements, apparently angry that she had given him the slip. He began ransacking the place, opening cupboards and rifling through drawers, finding them empty. Most of her stuff was packed up in boxes in the centre of the living room. The stranger seemed to notice the boxes, for he stood and stared at them for a while, his back to the window. Then he slowly turned around and began looking out of the window at the apartments facing Laura's. He froze as he spotted Laura in the kitchen of 5E, and their eyes met. "Shit! My goodness!" shrilled Mrs. Rispoli. At first Laura thought she had alarmed the old woman by swearing, and was about to apologize. "There's a man in your apartment," Mrs. Rispoli said, taking the phone from Laura's hand. She began to dial 911. Laura almost stopped her. She tried to think of an explanation for the man's presence in her apartment. A boyfriend, perhaps? But in truth, she was glad that somebody was now acting on her behalf. She had been scared out of her wits for so long, and she was so tired of being scared. Let Mrs. Rispoli call the cops. Let them come and arrest this guy. Let this damned cult do its worst. Incriminate her, incriminate themselves. She didn't care now. All she wanted was to not be scared any more. The man saw her and the phone in Mrs. Rispoli's hand, and must have understood what was happening, for he made a sudden move for the door. Mrs. Rispoli had already given the dispatcher on the other end of the line her address by the time Laura made it to the door and slid the bolt home. The man was coming to kill her, she was sure of it, and poor Mrs. Rispoli too. She fumbled with the chain and secured it just as something heavy slammed against the door on the other side. Mrs. Rispoli screamed, the receiver still in her hand, the squawking voice of the woman on the other end begging her to stay calm. Again and again the man slammed himself against the door, making its hinges rattle. It wouldn't hold for much longer, even with the chain on. The man was too heavy, too strong, and too desperate to get in at them. Laura backed up into the kitchen and seized a knife to defend herself with. If this was to be her last stand, then she swore she'd take the bastard with her before he laid a finger on Mrs. Rispoli. The door jambs began to splinter under repeated attempts of the man to break his way in. Mrs. Rispoli cowered behind Laura, who held the kitchen knife out in front of her, ready to use it as soon as he broke through. And then the barrage of blows stopped. Silence reigned. Laura crept up to the door and nervously peered through the peephole. The fisheye lens afforded her a distorted view of the corridor. It was empty. The man was gone. "The police are outside," Mrs. Rispoli said by the kitchen window. "They've got somebody. Grabbed him as he ran out the door." An hour or so later, the police left them, taking the intruder and their statements with them. It was a stroke of luck that a patrol car had been in the area, or who knew what might have happened. He was a nut, they said, raving about some demon telling him to kill. He was suspected of a number of other break-ins, murders and arsons throughout the city. Did he act alone? The police officer had given her a funny look when she had asked that. Why, of course he did. Psychopaths rarely work in tandem. No, this cat was just a lone wolf, and now he would be behind bars. She had nothing to worry about. He was very insistent on that. Laura had said nothing to the police about the cult, the film, Grady, and about her suspicions that this nut was anything but a lone wolf. She apologized to Mrs. Rispoli for bringing such awfulness literally to her front door. "Well, it's hardly your fault, dear," she had said, still visibly shaking from the episode. "These maniacs are wholly unpredictable." Laura went back to her apartment, her skin crawling at being back in the rooms so recently ransacked by her would-be murderer. She looked out the window at Mrs. Rispoli's apartment. She could see the old lady puttering about before turning off the kitchen light and heading to bed. This was exactly where the intruder had stood and looked at her, she realized with a shiver. She began carrying her things down to her car. She would spend the night with her parents. There was no way she could sleep in her apartment that night, and the lock was busted in any case. She hadn't wanted to go to her parents because she was frightened of dragging them into this, but it would only be for the night. Tomorrow she would go to her new place and try to start a new life. She carried the last of her things down to her car and then got in, turned the ignition, and without a single glance back at the tenement, drove away. Her new apartment was bare and cold, but it was someplace new and a long way from Crown Heights, and that gave her some comfort, even if she knew deep down that she would never really feel safe. She knew that the cult would find her if they wanted to, but she forced herself to think positively. Maybe the arrest of one of their number would make them cool off, scare them back into the shadows. She doubted the man that had been arrested would talk. He'd stick to his demon story and plead insanity, rather than risk the vengeance of his fellow cultists. And she hadn't said anything to the cops. They'd know that, wouldn't they? Would that be enough for them? She had proven that she would keep her mouth shut, and they'd leave her alone, confident that they had scared her enough, that she posed no threat to them. She had to keep believing in that, or she would never sleep again. The week that followed encouraged her. She unpacked, got her new apartment in order, went to work like normal, if a little sleepy-eyed, and tried her best to get on with her life. And nothing happened. No more cars followed her or tried to drive her off the road, and no maniacs tried to break into her apartment. On Thursday night her phone rang. It was Cleo, and the sound of her chirpy voice seemed to Laura like an echo from another life. "Where have you been, Laura?" Cleo demanded. "You weren't at the Pandora last Saturday. We had a blast." "I've been unwell," Laura said. "Oh, honey, nothing serious?" "No, just a little under the weather. I haven't felt much like hitting the dance floor." "You okay now?" "Better." "Well, I'm throwing a party at the beach house this weekend. It's going to be terrific. You absolutely have to come." "I don't know, Cleo." "Oh, Laura, it will do you good to get out. See people, you know. Get back in the saddle." Laura bit her lip. Despite the past week's relative return to normalcy, she hadn't recovered her party animal spirit. The thought of being surrounded by lots of people, putting on a happy face, and pretending to be as carefree as she had been before all of this had started, filled her with dread. But then maybe Cleo was right. The alternative was to spend another night in her lonely apartment, jumping at every noise, and letting her thoughts dwell on Grady and the cult, which they always did at night. "All right, I'll come." "Super. I'll pick you up at 6 tomorrow. We'll drive down to the beach house and spend the weekend there. It's going to be wild." It was late Friday evening by the time they were heading down Long Island. Laura looked out the window as the houses and stores petered out into long stretches of grassy dunes, punctuated by the occasional lone beach house. She had barely spoken during the journey, and Cleo had struggled to keep any conversation going. The new surroundings did little to lift her spirits. Long Island was a desolate place in late autumn, windswept and bleak, with only the occasional small squares of yellow light in the darkness, denoting somebody at home in one of the isolated beach houses. They pulled up outside a dark house, etched against the shifting greys of the cloudy night sky. The wind whipped at Laura as she got out and helped Cleo carry their things into the house, her hair obscuring her face the whole time. "It's just us tonight. Everybody else is coming tomorrow," said Cleo, as she flicked on the lights and started making the place seem alive. "You can take the spare room upstairs to your left. I'll fix us some drinks. Let's get this party started." Laura carried her small suitcase upstairs and found the spare room, light and airy with a soft, comfortable bed. She sat down on the edge of the bed and gathered her thoughts. She still wasn't quite in the mood for Cleo's high energy, and the bed was so inviting that she considered lying down on it just for a moment, but she knew that she'd fall asleep, and that would be rude. Cleo seemed intent on cheering her up, so she felt she had to oblige. Downstairs, Cleo had put on a record, and the sounds of George McRae's Rock Your Baby floated up the stairs. Laura got up and went out into the hallway. Framed prints of Cleo's modelling shots lined the walls. Her parents sure were proud of their daughter's career. Laura perused them while Cleo clinked about with glasses and ice in the kitchen below. One of the prints caught Laura's eye. It was a black and white shot of Cleo lying on a wide circular bed, her head lazily propped up on her right arm. The window behind her showed the lower part of Manhattan across the harbour. It was a view that caused a sudden chill to ripple up Laura's spine. She had seen that view before, through that very window, from that very bed. She backed away from the picture. It couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Cleo was no nun, and may well have shacked up with Grady at some point. But Cleo had seen Grady at the Pandora that night. It had been Cleo who had urged her to flirt with him. She had known him. They had known each other. A queasy feeling took over Laura's whole body. This was all wrong. She had even asked Grady if he had seen Cleo that night. She had asked him if he did fashion shots. Not really, he had said. Only private commissions. A car door slammed outside. Cleo had said that it would be just the two of them tonight, so who the hell was this? She went back into the bedroom and looked out the window. Below, a cream Ford Galaxy was parked. A man was walking towards the house. Laura recognized him. She had seen his face at the party Grady had taken her to. She had seen his naked body. She had seen him as part of that writhing mass of sweaty limbs and bodily fluids as that girl had been murdered. She felt like she was going to throw up as she heard the front door open and Cleo's voice greeting him. She knows this guy too. She knows all of them because she's one of them. Laura knew that she had to get out of the house somehow, but she was trapped. They were downstairs and she was upstairs. She could hear them talking about her. She looked around for somewhere to hide. The closet? Another bedroom? No, that was silly. Those would be the first places they would look, and they would look for her. Footsteps on the stairs. Laura froze like a deer caught in the headlights, paralyzed with terror. She quickly turned the key in the lock and looked about for something she could use as a weapon. Seizing a lamp from the nightstand, she gripped it in both hands, yanking the electrical cord from the wall. The door handle turned, and somebody on the other side rattled it. "Laura?" Cleo called. "Why did you lock the door?" "Fuck this," said a man's voice, and a gunshot sent a large splinter of wood flying across the room. "Jesus, he has a gun!" "It has to look like an accident, you moron!" Cleo yelled. An accident. They really did mean to murder her then, silence her for good. And Cleo had always been her best friend. Laura tossed the lamp aside, her thoughts now only on escape, on survival. The bedroom window led out onto a sloped roof. This side of the house faced the driveway. If she could drop down, she could make a run for it. She hurried over to the window and heaved it open. Hoisting herself up onto the sill, she began squirming herself through the window as the man in the hallway began kicking the door in with frantic energy. She had just managed to squeeze her way out onto the roof when the door flung open and the man stormed into the room, gun in his hand, with Cleo behind him, peering over his shoulder. He made a grab for Laura and she rolled out of his reach, nearly losing her purchase on the rough felt shingles of the sloped roof. "Get her!" Cleo yelled, "but don't shoot her!" Laura jammed her feet into the gutter and held on, cat-like, as the man began clambering out of the window, his gun shoved into his waistband. "Just push her off!" Cleo called. "Suicide works too." Jesus, what the hell is wrong with Cleo? Laura wondered as her would-be murderer crept down the shingles towards her. When did her best friend turn utterly insane? She looked down, craning her head to see over the edge of the roof. It was quite a drop, and there were no bushes to cushion her fall. Even if she hung by her fingertips, she would probably break a leg or something, and then there would be no hope of escape. The man was close now, hands outstretched to grab her. She screamed and shuffled her way along the roof, out of his reach. She squirmed her way up so she had more room and got to her feet, but the man was upon her, his strong hands grasping her around the shoulders. She screamed again and kicked with her legs, catching him right in the groin. He yelled in pain, but didn't let go of her. The agony in his private parts sank him to his knees, dragging Laura with him, pulling them both off balance. They began rolling towards the edge of the roof. "Watch out!" Cleo screamed. They rolled into empty air and plummeted towards the ground. The wind was knocked from Laura's lungs as she landed on top of her attacker, at the same time as she heard a bone-crunching thud and felt his body convulse beneath her. She rolled off him and got shakily to her feet, amazed that she was unscathed. The man was dead. The back part of his skull had smashed against the driveway with enough force to split it like a watermelon. Blood pooled from beneath him, and his glazed eyes looked up at the shifting clouds in the night sky. Tears streaming down her face, Laura looked up at the house. She saw Cleo leaning out of the bedroom window, gazing down on the scene with a horrified expression. Then she vanished from view. Laura turned and ran down the driveway towards the road. She looked up and down its length, hoping that some late-night driver would pass by and pick her up, but the road was deserted. She looked back at the house and could see Cleo coming down the driveway towards her, the beam of a flashlight sweeping the ground in front of her. Laura crossed the road and headed into the dunes, which were silvery humps in the moonlight. The crashing of the surf nearby was a constant reminder that she was on a very thin spit of land, bordered by the sea on both sides. Her only way of escape lay east or west, and it was a long walk in either direction before she encountered a neighbouring house. Her feet kicked up sand as she ran down the grassy dunes towards the sea. She headed for the longest patch of grass she could see and flung herself flat on her belly as Cleo emerged at the top of the dune, her flashlight scanning the area. Something glinted in her other hand, and Laura saw that it was a kitchen knife. "She's actually going to kill me! My best friend is going to kill me!" "Laura!" Cleo called. "Come on out! Let's talk!" Talk? That was a joke. "Why did you run, Laura?" Cleo asked. "Why did you run from us when we could have given you so much? I know you must think I'm crazy right about now, but you don't understand what it was like for me after you left. I never did good in school like you. I didn't have a comfy office job waiting for me. Waiting on tables was all I had ahead of me. That's why I needed this, Laura. I needed my big break, and I deserved it. It was all right for you. You went off and started a new life, but did you ever think about what it was like for me? I had nothing but my dreams, Laura, and they offered me a chance to fulfill them. Look at what I have now, thanks to them. You could have had that too. You could have been anybody you wanted to be, but you blew it, Laura. You blew it, and now I have to kill you. They're making me do it. You don't get how powerful they are, Laura. I have to do this." The beam of the flashlight swept closer and closer to Laura's position, and it was only a matter of time before Cleo found her. The kitchen knife was gripped tightly in her hand, ready to strike the killing blow for her demonic cult as soon as she had Laura in her sights. Laura's hand found the rock, almost without looking for it. Its hard, round smoothness fitted her hand, and she knew she had a crude weapon that might just save her life. Cleo had her back to her, mere feet from her hiding spot. It was now or never. Laura slowly rose to her feet, the rock gripped in her fist, as primal as the howling dawn of man. This was what they had been reduced to, killers in the night. Cleo must have heard her, for she spun around at the last minute, surprise showing in her widened eyes. Laura didn't hesitate or change course, not one iota. She swung the rock at Cleo's face, catching her across the nose. Bone shattered and blood spurted. Cleo screamed, and both flashlight and knife tumbled to the sand as she brought her hands up to her shattered face. "My nose!" she howled. "My nose, you fucking bitch!" So much for her modelling career, Laura thought, as she dropped to her knees and scrabbled about in the sand for the knife. The flashlight lay where it had fallen, illuminating their feet and casting shadows up across their faces like the fires of hell were burning beneath them. Through her mask of blood and snot, Cleo looked up in time to see Laura come at her again, this time with the knife. The blade sank into her chest, somewhere in the region of the heart. Laura stabbed deep, pushing the sharp metal through the breastbone. Cleo sucked in a great gulp of air in her agony. Her bloody hands grasped at Laura's, and together they held onto the knife that jutted out of her chest as Cleo's knees buckled and they sank to the sand. "Laura!" Cleo stammered as the blood pumped from around the blade. I'm sorry." Her eyes rolled back in their sockets as her facial muscles relaxed into the slack expression of death. Laura stepped away from her, her body racked with sobs. It was a long walk before a pickup truck spotted the lone girl wandering down Dune Road in the middle of the night, her clothes smeared with what looked like blood. The driver took her to the Nassau County Police Station, and Laura told the uniformed officers everything. There was no point in holding back any more. The cult was trying to kill her, and would keep trying until they succeeded. Well, she was going to blow the whistle on them as loudly and for as long as she could. She was made to wait while a detective was summoned, and then had to repeat her whole story all over again. Detective Welch, a middle-aged man with wide sideburns, listened without saying a word. "And you say this cult has been making snuff films?" "Yeah," said Laura. "Sick stuff at a house in Yonkers." "Do you know the address?" "No, but I could point out the house if you took me there. I know roughly where it is." "I see. Now, about this couple who tried to murder you. What did you say the man's name was?" "I don't know." "And he's part of this Yonkers crowd too?" "Yes, I guess. I mean, I don't really know where they're based. They're everywhere." Detective Welch frowned at her, and she got the feeling that he wasn't taking her story seriously. She guessed it sounded kind of far-fetched, but it was true, damn it. Squad cars were dispatched to the beach house to investigate her claims, and she lay down on the sofa in the detective's office and slept fitfully for a few hours. It was dawn when Detective Welch woke her. "Our officers found the bodies up at the house," he told her. "Looks like a murder-suicide. I don't know what went on up there, but I'd say you were lucky to escape. You're not a suspect in any case." Wait, are you saying that both bodies were found in the house? Laura asked. That's right. One in the kitchen with multiple stab wounds, and then the fella seems to have thrown himself off the roof. Oh my God, Laura thought. They've got to the scene before the police. Tampered with it. How did they know? How the hell did they know? Now we have your statement and we'll be contacting you if we need to talk to you again. As for now, miss, you're free to go. Is there somebody who can come and pick you up? Free to go, Laura said, but 2 people are dead, and they moved the bodies. Who did? The cult. Detective Welsh sighed. Are you sure you kids weren't taking drugs up at that beach house? I'm not on drugs, damn it. Now somebody tampered with that crime scene. Somebody is trying to fool you, Detective. Aren't you a little bit interested in why? Detective Welsh got up in frustration and left her alone in his office. She sat and watched him through the glass door as he spoke with some of his colleagues, their voices muffled. Then he picked up a telephone receiver and dialed a number. He turned to look at her through the glass, receiver to his ear. Who is he calling? Laura wondered. And why is he looking at me like that? It was the expression of one who is fed up with a vermin problem and is calling the exterminator. It was a look that chilled Laura to the bone. What if the police are part of it? Grady had told her that this thing went high up. How high? Detective Welsh had tried his hardest to dismiss her crazy story, and had comfortably believed the shaky cover-up that somebody had offered him. Too comfortably. Laura slowly got up and left the police station. She ignored Detective Welsh's gaze as she headed towards the exit. He couldn't help her. Perhaps nobody could. Perhaps it was over. She would go back to her apartment and try to live her life. She had tried to warn everybody. She had tried to tell her story, but they wouldn't believe her. It was an impossible fight, so why bother fighting it? The cult was too powerful and would continue to do what it had been doing for perhaps generations, centuries even. What hope did she have against such powers of darkness? She was free to go, Detective Welsh had said. Well, perhaps it was time she went. Not much later, in a disco in Bay Ridge, the music throbbed and the dancers moved to the beat. A blonde girl in a red dress with Farrah Fawcett hair and a timid demeanour moved away from her circle of friends and headed to the bar. She ordered a creme de menthe and lit a cigarette. Further along the bar, a man was watching her. He'd been watching her all night. In fact, he'd been waiting for her to come in. He watched her sip her drink and smoke her cigarette. Maybe she noticed him, maybe she didn't. It didn't matter. She'd notice him soon enough. The girl turned to look at the dance floor. She was single, pretty but shy. Other girls were getting chatted up at the bar, but not her. She didn't seem to attract the same kind of attention. The man moved along the bar and sidled up to her. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said back, pretending to notice him for the first time. He was cute. "You want to dance?" If you've enjoyed this short story, be sure to read P.J. Thorndike's follow-up novel, Road of Souls, available from Amazon.